Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I am your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Hard Boiled from 1992. Now, Hard Boiled is the last film, I believe, that John Woo directed as a Hong Kong director, essentially, before he made the move to primarily or wholly producing in the United States. And I think we need to talk about John Woo. I don't know that you can talk about this movie without talking about John Woo. Now, I'm not a great connoisseur of action films, but I think I have a pretty good grasp on the history therein and influences and those sorts of things. That's the kind of stuff I enjoy, is the behind the scenes understanding, cinematic influences and background and cultural changes and those sorts of things. John Woo is an interesting character. Lots of people know of or about John Woo or have heard his name because he's arguably one of the most prolific Hollywood directors to come out of Hong Kong. He gets a lot of praise, and it's not wholly undeserved. But I have a lot of gripes, concerns, thoughts about John Woo as a director. And I hesitate to say it, but I don't want to say, what I don't want to say is that John Woo is the worst thing that ever happened to Hollywood action films. But I'm also not going to not say that. John Woo has a very distinct style, having originally for decades worked in Hong Kong action cinema, particularly in martial arts films and the like. He worked with Jackie Chan and a lot of the other big name stars in Hong Kong for quite a while, and then sort of in the 80s transitioned to adopting a different sort of style, or such is my impression. Most of my experience with John Woo has been with his Hollywood films. I can't recall if this is the only Hong Kong film that I've watched of his, but sort of part of my intention with watching this was to see some of that history as well. Hard Boiled was, like I said, I believe the last film he really made in Hong Kong before moving to the States. And it's a synthesis of a lot of things, a lot of the style that he would come to be known for in the 90s. Now, there's another, what's the name of it's Better Off, hold on. I was just thinking of it and now it's going to bother me. In the 80s, he made one other very successful film, and my understanding is this one was less successful. It's A Better Tomorrow. That's it. That was one of the movies he became most famous for prior to his moving to Hollywood. That was from 86. I haven't seen that one either, but I'm going to have to watch it. It's interesting to see, going backwards in time, his influences and the things he does and doesn't do well, and the way he evolves over time. And to get back to my original thought, my biggest gripe with him is that I think a lot of Hollywood in the 90s and on, Hollywood action films would come to ape a lot of his style without really understanding what understanding nuance or understanding where it came from or even necessarily taking the right lessons from it. Because this will come as, I mean, nobody who pays attention to the movie industry will be surprised by this. Hollywood is fundamentally about chasing what will make money. And John Woo would go on to make a series of very successful films, especially at relatively low budgets. This is a weird one. Hardboiled has quite a lot of notable actors in it, mostly from the Hong Kong scene. The lead is played by Chow Yun-fat, and there's a number of other notable actors, although my specific familiarity with their prior work is less than, I enjoy Hong Kong action films, but I haven't watched a huge number of them, so I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge. Just a few people that I recognize. So where does this fall? I'm all over the place with this film because I'm having a hard time processing it. It's a bizarre affair. John Woo is really the master of barely controlled chaos. He, both in this film and many of his others, what you're watching on screen just skirts the line between completely impossible to follow and barely, like that barely cohesive line. There are clearly a lot of influences from earlier Hong Kong action cinema, including some of the camera shots that are used. A lot of the sweeping camera shots are consistent with what I would expect from especially somewhat later Hong Kong action cinema, following characters for what would in other cases have been martial arts moves, but John Woo being known for gun fu, so to speak. I actually don't know where that coin was termed, but it's attributed, that style is attributed to him. The sort of combination of gun fights and Hollywood action with, hand-to-hand combat, martial arts, that sort of thing. And this film is really all over the place with what you're going to get from scene to scene. It never quite falls apart, which sounds, I guess, as I hear it coming out of my mouth, sounds more negative than I really intend it to. The variety in the film is impressive. Some scenes are massive shootouts. Some of them have lots of pyrotechnics. Some of them have, tons of blood and gore and, people being riddled with bullets. I was thinking in my head throughout this film, just, I wonder what the budget was, what the line, like, I want to know what the line item price was on all of the fake blood that was used in this film. It generally avoids, with I think maybe one, maybe two exceptions, it avoids being really gruesome. And I think that's something that Woo does pretty well, generally. But it is very violent. What is interesting is that it does keep some of the action hero's resiliency that is more common in earlier Hong Kong action cinema, where your protagonists get beat up, they get beaten down, and they get up and they're hurt, and they're willing to show that they're hurt, but they're not taken out of the fight. Repeatedly in this film, people get shot and get up from it. And that's also fascinating to me compared to not only to Hollywood and what would come after as influenced by this, but I'm losing my train of thought. People getting shot and not going down in one is one thing, but since Wu is also known for having these scenes where hundreds of people get shot and do these really exaggerated, like, ragdoll, they do the shimmy while they're getting riddled with bullets, and then they keel over and die, because they're cannon fodder for the main characters. So the juxtaposition of those two things, where bullets are completely lethal to anyone who isn't a primary villain, but despite that, the fact that the protagonists can still get shot and not be out for the count, is fascinating to me. Obviously, in a lot of Hollywood action cinema, getting shot is either a guaranteed death, or it's you're taken out of the action. If your hero gets shot, they have to be dragged away and patched up, which I guess I would have to imagine that influence comes in no small part from the many war films that would come after the Second World War, and Korea and Vietnam and all those things. Anyway, the treatment of gunshot wounds is a fascinating thing to hone in on. There are a lot of action scenes that get a lot of praise in this film, and I don't want to malign them all by any means. There's quite a lot that is very good in this. And in fact, the level of spectacle that was here was far beyond what I had imagined. It's interesting because the movie evolves so much from beginning to end, not only in terms of its scope, but also to some extent its literal quality. The first set piece is almost fascinatingly poorly put together. Like it was shot by it was shot by a different not like it was shot by a different director, but that the whatever it's almost like they didn't get funding until after somebody saw the first scene. But that's not even, I don't even want to malign the first scene, because there's quite a lot that's good in there as well. A lot of that Hong Kong influence is very apparent in a lot of the action scenes, many of which vary dramatically in their scope and intention. The first scene being essentially a shootout in a restaurant, mostly with handguns. Despite this closed set piece and relatively few involved parties relative to what would come later, it's interesting to see just how much chaos is caused as a result. I apologize. There's going to be some weird pauses in this because I'm struggling to comprehend what I watched. there The first scene teaches us a lot about who the character is, his values. I should mention the main character's name is Tequila, and he likes to drink tequila and soda. And they deliver that with not an ounce of irony. It's kind of fantastic. But that first scene tells you so much about who he is, what he values, who he respects, who he doesn't, and his attitude towards both his job, his compatriots, and the general populace as a whole. A lot of that first scene is very hard to follow. Getting back to my point about the funding. It's well choreographed. It's generally pretty well shot, but there's so much chaos in basically one room, or certainly in one building, and you don't know a lot of the characters well enough yet that between all that and like flying debris and all the gunshots going off and flying smoke and flour and whatever, there's so much chaos in that room that it can be very hard to, like, it's shot competently, but then actually trying to discern through the smoke, wait, who's that? Who's firing at who? The scene gets a lot of praise for being easy to follow. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's impossible to follow, but on more than one occasion in, the course of just a couple of minutes, I went, wait, who's that? Who's shooting who? Who's getting shot? I thought somebody who dies in the first scene had also already died in that scene twice. Because through a combination of all the chaos and what they were wearing not being that unique to other people in the room, I just couldn't tell. And this really gets to something about Woo's style that I don't love, or think can be detrimental to his own efforts. Which is just the focus of his camera wavers too much. It ends up looking at a lot of people who don't matter for a lot of time. And while I think it's a very interesting thing from a just wanting to see a, action spectacle thing to show the chaos in sort of reverse shot type of thing. The focus on nameless characters, just gun wielders who are about to be shot or whatever, can sort of take away from the weight of, hold on, is that a person or is it just somebody they're setting up to get shot? That continues throughout the film and throughout, I think, a lot of Woo's work. But that scene in particular has the problem the most. This again gets to a larger issue I have with Woo's films where the focus is so much on the spectacle, whether that's people getting shot, people getting blown up, cars getting blown up, just random debris flying around, the chaos of a room under fire whatever it is. And this film has all different kinds of versions of that. It detracts from the visual storytelling that can be done with an action scene. That's not to say that it's without value, though. I don't want anybody to think that I don't enjoy that myself, even. If you just want to watch a film where shit gets fucked up, you'd be hard pressed to do a lot better than watching a John Woo film. But Hard Boiled has a lot more to offer, and I think it's not capitalized on that well. Especially with Chow Yun-fat, who is a great actor in his own right, and playing against people who are also quite talented as actors. The amount of time spent focusing on the chaos of ensuing gunfights rather than on the interpersonal connections is, I don't know, I guess it's disappointing. There are quite a few characters in this film who are named, have lines, have characterization. It's actually done quite well. The first introduction to Tequila's girlfriend, or love interest, or whatever the case may be, because they're, well, I won't spoil it. The first introduction to her is kind of fantastic because she immediately shows that she's got like a level of disdain for him, and the dynamic between the two as they play off each other is done really well. She has, lines of her own. She's not she's not a damsel to be won or anything like that. And they actually riff off each other. It feels immediately like a genuine relationship. That also goes for quite a number of the other characters, whether it's the boss, the other police officers, other characters that I won't call out specifically in case you don't want any of this spoiled. The introductions, the way they conduct themselves, and the dialogue itself is all quite well done. And then it's not really it, but there's not enough of it. And two, it's not capitalized on that well. Fundamentally speaking, the story of the film is extremely simple. It takes some influence from, well, obviously, noir stylings. The name Hard Boiled is obviously an allusion to sort of neo-noir style. It also takes influence from a number of other genres, and obviously Hong Kong action cinema. I would say 80s military action films, pulp cinema from the 70s and stuff like that. There's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. And I can't do it very well on my own. So I apologize for that, because I am just sort of rambling. But again, it's not that focused. And the film Wu doesn't ruin the film by any means by focusing on the things he really loves, which are the spectacle of the fights. But it's lost opportunity, at least in my mind. And clearly, between the actors and the director and the script, they clearly had the capacity to. It's not like they couldn't. It's not like they didn't have the talent. They clearly could. Unfortunately, that part of it doesn't come together that well. And it comes down to just mostly a series of I don't want to say that the story and all that are relegated to a back burner, necessarily relegated just for the sake of, leading them to the next fight, but it sort of feels like that at times. I did watch just to be clear, I did watch this in Chinese with the Chinese audio. I think it's in Cantonese. With subtitles. I do question some of the subtitles. I don't speak Chinese, but there are clearly some inconsistencies in the script between the subtitles and what's actually being said, which is unfortunate. It's a pet peeve of mine. I have transcribed entire movies myself to get an accurate subtitle set before because it pisses me off when the wording isn't right. And it always bothers me to notice at all if it's in a foreign language I don't speak, because the nuance of the language is, important. But that doesn't mean it doesn't still come through pretty well. It does always make me wonder what I'm missing, though, and that's disappointing to say the least. What is fascinating about this film in general is that it's made for not that much money. Allegedly, the budget was $4.5 million, which is astonishingly low, especially for the amount of, not only of I made the joke about the blood, but the amount of pyrotechnics and practical effects that were used, and admittedly being shot in Hong Kong, the price to, do certain, to, set up sets and do all the production is probably, or was at the time, probably cheaper. But still, $4.5 million is like unbelievably inexpensive for what you actually end up seeing on the screen. There are a couple of, well, I would say pretty much every set is actually really well dressed. There are some lighting and cinematography issues where what's on screen is just muddier than it had to be, which is unfortunate. But I'm sure that's in no small part due to the budget. Despite that, there's some pretty extraordinary, like I said, for the money, what's on screen is extraordinary on its own. And there are a number of scenes, including fight scenes, which again, I don't hate, that look fantastic. Well choreographed, well designed, well shot. The spectacle is very present and very enjoyable for the most part. Like I had said, my only gripe is just sometimes it becomes hard to follow. There are a couple of shots in particular that are really extraordinary. One that is rather famous, a long take of two characters going through a hallway. They go through a hallway, get in an elevator, and 20 seconds later they come back out of that elevator and clear another hallway. And the production required to shoot that at all, let alone for a production team to, in the 20 seconds, go out, reset it, and have them shoot again without a cut, is stunning. It's not perfect, but production-wise, that's a legendary effect that I will not soon forget. That is going to come to one specific thing about the editing, and I'm talking about the editing in general, but I don't understand why in that long shot, as well as in some of the other scenes, they use bad slow motion. John Woo's known for using slow motion, and in this film he does it correctly. There are a number of shots that use proper slow motion where you run the film faster so that in playback you have the frames to work with. And I understand that some of it is expense, but I think a lot of it has to do with editing. In this long shot, as well as many other places in the film, they use they add the slow motion in the edit. And there are no extra frames in there because you were only shooting at 24 frames a second. So effectively, when you slow the film down, you're just repeating frames. This is not unprecedented, especially in the 80s and 90s. It's not entirely rare to see this cheap version or the version of slow motion where they don't speed up the film. It's not entirely rare to see that done. However, it kind of always looks bad. And especially in this day and age, it's something that's aged particularly poorly. And that shot I was talking about is so fantastic that the few portions of it where they slow down the film are extra glaring in how weird and kind of bad they look. So that's kind of a shame to me. As far as the editing goes, again, I don't know how much influence Woo has on his own editing. My understanding is that he's pretty closely monitoring the edit as it goes through in most of his films. As far as cutting together scenes, this is another effect that Woo has had, lasting effect Woo had on Hollywood as a whole. He does it acceptably, but Hollywood has not, which is these frequent cuts. I've spoken before, and most people who watch any Hollywood films with action in them are very familiar with the extremely frequent cutting that happens in a lot of action films. Woo does it well, as it adds to the chaos without completely detracting from the continuity. And he does it pretty well in a way that also helps you remember potentially many things that are going on at the same time. Comparatively speaking, I think Hollywood, after that, would leverage the same effect for a much more sinister purpose, that being hiding all of their bad filming or hiding the lack of talent on screen. It's very common in in films these days to, see a lot of people who are clearly not hitting each other. Comparatively speaking, in this film and many of Woo's other films, you clearly see the hits. You sometimes see them 2, 3, 4, 5 times because he wants to make sure you saw it. And that has its own issues sometimes, because it is a pretty ham-fisted way of getting across the action. It's really an extension of a different type of editing that was done in a lot of Hong Kong action films, where Jackie Chan has a really good interview where he talks about how you basically, like, you hit somebody in the wide, and you come into contact with them on the wide, and then you cut to a closer shot or a different angle, and your fist is like a couple of frames back. So you essentially see the hit twice, and it gives more weight to it, but you don't notice it. Woo takes a much more ham-fisted approach to that, where he shows you the whole thing 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and he shows you the whole lead up. In much the same way you might see Hollywood show you the same explosion 4 times from 4 different angles because it was expensive and they want to make sure you saw it. But again, it's a stylistic choice that I don't think is necessarily detrimental. It works well, and as long as you can get past some of the, like, sort of bizarreness of it, because it is something rather unique to Woo, I think it's just interesting more than anything else. But I bring it up because it is not only because of its lasting effect, but also because it does add a bit more chaos. In the same way that I was talking about earlier, that first scene being hard to follow, the frequent cuts, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it keeps you in the loop with various goings-on in the same room at the same time. On the other hand, it can make it very difficult, especially with some of the more lackluster cinematography and issues with framing and lighting and, motion, where it's hard to follow who's shooting and who's getting shot and who's the bad guys and who's the good guys, so to speak. And with that specific thing being sort of a key part of the film itself, in a not in a meta way, in a direct, allusion to the plot, it makes it all the weirder. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling at this point. I don't really know how I feel about this film. I have very mixed feelings. Is it bad? No, definitely not. Is it great cinema? No, I wouldn't say that either. But certainly, even relative to a lot of American action films that would come later, I would very likely prefer to watch this over a lot of those, even the ones that are often better produced, better shot, better written, more cohesively edited, better budgeted. This is still, in many ways, a more compelling viewing experience. And despite all my gripes, and despite my somewhat dislike for Woo's continued effect on Hollywood action, there's a certain appreciation I definitely have for this film. I'm definitely going to have to go and watch A Better Tomorrow at some point. I don't really know. I don't know whether I'll put that on this on the channel or not. Maybe I'll watch it and gauge whether it's worth having the discussion again. But yeah, learning a little bit more, especially seeing this, especially if you've watched either you have you're well versed in like 80s and 90s Hollywood action films, and want to see some of the influence, or if you're just if you're more specifically curious about John Woo or about Hollywood action as a production style, I think it's a worthy watch, despite all the other goofy, weird things that I've already mentioned. Oh man, there's one thing right at the end that just is too bizarre. Did I mention the tone of this film swings all over the place? It's pretty nuts. Anyway, if you're interested at all, I would recommend it. But caveat emptor. Anyway, thank you guys for watching a longer than usual episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm the Social Solipsist, and I will see you guys next time.